All right. Well, I'm speaking to Mr. Norman Voss from the International Coalition for Papua. He has agreed to talk to us via Zoom since it would be approximately 2 a.m. His time during the conference time, and he has a very busy schedule on either day. So he's generously agreed to do a pre-interview for us. Thank you, Norman.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so first, could I ask you, if you don't mind, to tell me a little bit about the ICP, what your role and position is in the ICP, how long you have been an analyst of the West Papuan conflict, and just more generally, what the ICP's position on the conflict on West Papua is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm the coordinator and the secretariat of the International Coalition for Papua. The coalition has been there for many years, for almost 20 years now. And it's a group of organizations outside Indonesia that try to promote human rights and a peaceful solution to the conflict in West Papua. I've been working there for about 9 years now. And before that, I was working with the Asian Human Rights Commission, where I was also working on Indonesia, including on Papua. So I think it's been the last 15 years of my life that I've been looking at the human rights and conflict context in West Papua. Our organization is, we consider ourselves as a human rights organization. So we do not take any position on what a political configuration of a future of Papua should be. It's not our role to comment on who is the authority and where borders should go along. Our role is to look at the human rights situation and promote and ensure that every person there has the freedom to share their opinion, to be protected from killings, from torture. And we do hope that a political process, a non-violent, a non-armed process can be promoted so that there can be a sustainable solution to this very long-lasting conflict. We witness tens of thousands of people suffering directly and many more indirectly for decades, and there has to be an end. But it is not for us to comment on how such a configuration should look like. That's up to Indonesia and the people in Papua to sort out.
Okay, thank you. So the International Coalition for Papua, as you say, is an international body, a coalition of different human rights groups that closely follows and reports on acts of violence that take place in West Papua, particularly by the occupying or colonizing forces. So a lot of commentators are talking about that they've seen an increase in violence in West Papua, and a lot of Papuans are obviously saying that as well over the past few years. What are the most worrying things that you're seeing, the most worrying trends? And yeah, what do you think might be behind this kind of increase in violence in West Papua?
Well, we've been trying to monitor the human rights violations a bit more systematically for about 10 years now. So we do have annualized data on the number of cases of killings, of torture, of arrests that do not cover the entire picture, but at least the share that is documented. And when looking back at those past 8-9 years, we can see some fluctuations of some numbers going up and down now and then, but overall, there's no positive trend visible. Okay. I mean, some figures don't seem to get worse, but some do. Let's look at the number of killings, for example. They are definitely rising, while we were seeing some 10 to 15 cases of extrajudicial killings per year, some 5 years back. We now see around 30 or more per year. Right. A case that we consider as such a killing is where a non-armed civilian is killed by security forces, police, military. We're not counting into those numbers armed clashes between armed resistance group and victims on their side, which is another theme, of course. So we're just looking at those civilians being affected, and the numbers are just rising. We can see more and more indigenous Papuans becoming victims. We do not see such numbers on the side of the non-indigenous population,
Right.
the people who migrated to Papua. So it's really focused on ethnicity and is a clear indicator for a strong aspect of racial violence. So racism has been there for years, for decades, racial discrimination, racial violence, but it was becoming more part of a discussion now. It was a process of becoming more aware and raising that in the last 2-3 years. But it's not a new phenomenon. We can look at the number of peaceful demonstrations that have been forcefully intervened by security forces. Those numbers are also increasing. We had 38 to 37 in the last 2 years of such demonstrations that were then intervened. That's a lot higher than in the past. People are demonstrating more. The pressure of people to free themselves from those violations, from this violence, is increasing. The call for a solution, a way out of this stalemate of violence and military operations is increasing. And the main trigger point, I think, that brought in a big change, one main trigger point, was when those road workers were killed 2 years back in December, 3 years back. And you know, the Indonesian military explained that this was done by the armed resistance group. The armed resistance group actually said, there were some who said, yes, that was us, but they were actually working for the military. We know that the military does conduct also business operations, logging operations, mining operations. So that was their argument. I'm not in support of any form of violence from any side. But that incident was then really the beginning of a large military campaign. And since then, many areas in the highlands are practically inaccessible for observers, for foreign journalists, a lot more than before. And we receive a lot more reports of cases of disappearances now. We didn't have that many, almost no cases of reported disappearances, but now really military troops come into a village, abduct a person, that person is gone, and the military claims afterwards, we don't know, maybe somewhere else. That's a very worrying trend. And of course, with those operations, we have now tens of thousands of IDPs, internally displaced persons, who fled from, let's say, Nduga Regency to Wamena in the highlands. And these IDP communities then don't have access to sufficient healthcare, education for the children. I think this increase of killings and those massive IDP problems, humanitarian problems, are the big change in the last 2 or 3 years.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, Norman. So it's interesting that what we're seeing is an increase in protests for a solution, calling for a solution, and then at the same time, an increase in violence from the Indonesian security forces against civilians. So it's the tension, the violence directly corresponds to the West Papuan people trying to express their political will or trying to exercise their kind of political rights and trying to call for a solution.
Not only, I would add, you have that share of violations where violence is a response to a peaceful expression of political views, but you also have violence that is just purely racial. Right. Where Papuans are just being targeted on the street in a village at night, and then they're beaten up, tortured, and they don't survive the night of torture in the police station, where there's no evidence that there was even any political expression.
Right. So and is there an increase in those incidences that you're kind of observing, or is that just kind of been the same all along the way since the beginning of Indonesia's takeover of West Papua? Is that kind of something that's a more of a new trend?
I think it's hard to distinguish those two categories in some on a large statistical level, but the argument of security forces is in most cases that it was a political reason why somebody was killed. The person was a troublemaker. The person, you know, it's the stigmatization of being a separatist in general, just because you are indigenous Papuan, you look indigenous Papuan.
Okay, and then I suppose, so that's the justification that they give, but there's almost never any evidence from what I'm kind of seeing, and this is, I'm asking you, is this the case as well? There's almost never any evidence that those people are actually a formal member of the OPN or the TPN, you know, of the independence movement's armed forces. Is that the case? So
the cases that we report on are cases where the family confirms they are not, where the circumstances support clearly that view that they are not. It's not that any Papuan always denies to be related to resistance groups. You can find a lot of them who would openly say that, for which it is known. But many of the victims are young men. Many of them are minors, children, women just carrying food to their families. We have many such cases. So it's unbelievable to make these claims of political activism, and even if they would be politically active, you know.
Yeah, that's not an excuse for a extrajudicial killing. That's right. So can I ask you how the International Coalition for Papua obtains the information that you do? How do you kind of track, and what data do you collect to analyze these trends? How do you get it? And how do you verify that it is true?
In principle, we always need to use different sources and compare the data. So we're trying to see what different sources provide information to a case. Typically, we can see that you can have some sources that independently report about it, that show different aspects of a case. You can see many other sources that copy from it. The most important pillar of research here are professionally working human rights organizations, human rights activists that know how to document a case. That is different from tweeting something within a few minutes or hours, or what's going on social media. And then you have professional journalism, but generally we cannot just rely on some media reports. So we go back to organizations, to lawyers, to verify the data. We now have, it's an advantage of the Indonesian legal system. We can check the public court information system, SIPP. You can look up indictment, charges, the status of cases, the period of detention, prolongation of detentions. That information is often registered there, but mostly it's traditional documentation work by good human rights groups.
Okay, thank you. So we've been hearing a bit in the media recently about extrajudicial killings of West Papuans, particularly over the past couple of years, killings targeting religious leaders, or killings that have been, kind of taken place in revenge, or out of revenge for because Indonesian security forces are trying to avenge the killing of people within their own troops. And so they kind of indiscriminately target different Indigenous West Papuans. Are there any kind of notable cases that you'd like to bring to our attention at this moment?
Well, we had recently submitted to UN mechanisms some cases of killings that really show the current ongoing pattern, how killings take place in areas of military operations. For example, on 27th of February in Sugapa district, there was the Raider Infantry Battalion, 715. They arrested Mr. Donatus Kilike Midip. He was in Nuguzuga, a village. By that time, most of the villagers had fled from the months of military operations in the areas. He was left with a few others, and he was deaf. And his relatives explained he also had some mental disorders. So, but because he was still there when Indonesian army troops arrived, they just arrested him. They couldn't obviously really communicate with him, but he was not responding to their questions. He was taken to Songandugu village. On the way, he was tortured. That was witnessed by others. The Kingmi Church reported about it. He was then in that other village executed. And while being in detention, while being unarmed, while being not any security threat, they kept the body several hours after that killing. We can assume that he was heavily tortured, and the military then brought his body back, carried on a pole like you usually do with pigs, back to the church where they dumped him, and then the family was able to take care of the body of their family member. On 21st of March, Mr. Demianos Niwingalen was killed inside the Freeport concession. He was actually, according to his family, just in the forest doing panning for gold, which some local people do, and just at the river. So he was alone. But he was killed. The family found his body. The police claimed that he would have tried to attack security forces with a bow and an arrow. So you can imagine military just walking through the forest. They see somebody, and whether we can verify by now whether they were seeing a risk or not, it is just heavily affecting civilians that military personnel is freely operating in those areas. Let me give you another example. On 29th of March, Yamias Nagan, he was arrested and then disappeared. His wife was witnessing when they were in the garden, when the military troops came and took him away. He was asking them, please don't take my husband, please leave them here. But they told her, step back. So she was worried. They took him. That was the military task force radar Yonif 700. The community later went to the military and asked for him to be returned, either dead or alive, to get his body back. The military commander Christian Ireo from Dandem 1715, he then claimed, well, this was probably TPNPB, so Resistance Army, who arrested him to call for money in return or something. So that's the way they were covering this case up of a very clear disappearance. People are taken away and authorities deny that they have been taken away and deny what happened to them. And just some days ago, we haven't verified that case. Suara Papua reported about it. 3 women were killed in Ilaga Utara district. They were 12 years, 16 years, 20 years old. Data still needs to be verified. It's a new case, but it's a phenomenon that we will have to witness a lot. So the question that keeps us moving and that we try to highlight to all sides and parties is, we can expect another dozens or more killings in the coming few months. What can we do to avoid them? They haven't happened yet. Those people are dead. Right. What can we do to avoid what will happen in the coming weeks and days? How can we do that quickly?
And are these and are you anticipating the killings over the next months because of the increase of security forces that are being sent into the region at the moment? Or
absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. You have a context. Imagine you have a bubble in the highlands where military has a carte blanche to do what they want to do, where anybody who hasn't fled yet would easily be pointed at and labeled as a separatist, as a supporter. If somebody moves, somebody walks along the way, military can shoot at them and nobody will ever verify whether the military's claim afterwards that they were a threat, that they were separatists, are valid or not. There's no independent observance possible in this context.
So the army's operating, sorry?
It's lawlessness. It's just a war state in that bubble.
Yeah, the army is operating with complete impunity, which we've heard has been happening for a long time. So this is verifying that, okay. And recently, last week, I think it was, the well-known human rights activist and advocate Victor Yemo, who works also with a lot of independence-focused groups around West Papua and organises protests, has been arrested and charged with treason and with inciting many of the protests that occurred around West Papua last year. What do you think about these charges of treason? I mean, is he in your view a political prisoner? And how do you think he'll be treated in prison while he's held there?
I think that is clearly a case of political detention and arrest. The charges are not only treason, there are charges on incitement to violence, on conspiracy, arson, theft, collective violence. The emergency laws use not only the penal code, illegal possession of weapons,
right.
a super long list of charges.
They've hit him with the whole book.
Almost, so that could result in decades of imprisonment,
right.
Depending on how it goes. But it also shows that there's a certain arbitrariness in the way these people are being charged with crimes, how they are arrested. Victor Yamo was a spokesperson of the KNPB, which is a politically active group. They're advocating their political vision on what should happen in Papua, which is their right to do. And he was also running this movement, to my understanding, against this Otsus II plan about the autonomy law revision. So this is advocacy in relation to how the political future would be looking like. So this is, he was effectively engaging on the right to self-determination, which is according to Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Article 1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, a human right. So he was engaging on that right. In principle, Indonesia also recognizes that right, but not to the extent where it amounts to calling for independence. Nevertheless, the international legal standard is that it's a human right. He was engaged in that. On 9th of May, he was arrested. Local lawyers, when he was brought to Polder, I think LBH Papua, Legal Aid Foundation Papua, was supporting him. He has international support from Veronica Coleman, an excellent lawyer who is supporting political activists and their political freedom. He was brought to Brimob the day after, on 10th of May, and since then, many of these rights that you are entitled to in Indonesian law were denied, including that lawyers were having free access to him, that he was not allowed to contact his family members. His family members were not able to visit him. He was not given support and access to contact a doctor. And typically when you're arrested in Papua and then brought not only to police, but particularly the mobile brigades, you can expect that there's a very high risk of torture, at least ill treatment that is applied. I think he could likely face what others have faced in such political detention scenarios that could range from solitary confinement. Relocation is something we've seen with a few other cases. Misbuk Wijanga was such a case. He was arrested in Wamena and then brought to Jakarta, which made it almost impossible for family members to see him, for lawyers to support the case. So I don't know whether they will relocate him to another place with that intention as well. And as I recall, the last high-level arrest of a KNPB leader with Marco Tabuni ended in his killing. Marco Tabuni was killed during the event of arrest. Don't want to come up with the whole case of that time now, but it is not uncommon that politically detained Papuans that are active face torture or killings during arrest. So that's what we actually have to admit is a chance. We should give any support we have to his lawyers. And he should be released because the arrests of criminals need to take place. But here we have violations of criminal procedure law, violations of the rights of the detainee. So this is already from this point on no longer any fair criminal case.
Right. So a lot of West Papuans and countries around the world are now joining West Papuans and calling for a United Nations-led human rights investigation or fact-finding mission into West Papua to look at cases such as Victor's perhaps, but to look at many of the cases that you've outlined today and many more that are on the record. Indonesia has yet to set a date or to agree for such a fact-finding mission to take place. What should the United Nations be doing in the International Coalition for Papua's view?
Well, I think particularly now in the context of this terrorism label against the OPM and what was formerly known as criminal armed groups and so on, I think we can expect much more widespread arbitrary arrests. I expect an increase in violence, an increase of stigmatization of the general Papuan public. It is much easier than in the past to just arrest somebody because you can just point at them and say, we have a terrorist suspicion, we apply the terrorism law and not just the criminal procedure code here. So in this context, you need independent observance, you need monitoring. The UN has to, and that has been in the discussion for years, but delayed and delayed from the Indonesian side, the UN has to be given access to do the general monitoring work that they're doing in other parts of Indonesia, that they're doing in other countries. And I expect from Indonesia to cooperate with these UN mechanisms as other countries do. So that High Commissioner, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, should be given access to enter Papua, to monitor, to move freely, to look at what's going on and to verify the data. This is, to my understanding, what Papuans have been calling for many years, an independent verification. So I think they have a case here of they're not trying to cover something up, but trying to expose what's going on. And it's unfortunately the Indonesian side that is, to my understanding, obstructing this process. So such observers, UN have to visit, they have to report, they have to assess what's going on, and they have to contribute to working towards a solution, to a sustainable solution, so that these killings end.
Thank you so much for your time, Norman, and for your insights, and for, I guess, explaining how dire and the situation is, and how important it is that all of us get together to and work together to execute some action and to support West Papuans as they pursue their human rights. So we really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.